Hello and welcome to the Green Room at Furnitubes. I'm your host, Catherine Barrett, and we're here every month with a new episode. Join us for industry musings, interviews and discussions exploring all things landscape architecture, street furniture and urban design. I'm Catherine Barrett, MD of Furnitubes, and I'm here today with Jane Findlay, Director of FIRA and President of the Landscape Institute. We're going to be discussing the importance of landscape architecture today. Hi, Jane.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for inviting me here today. It's great to see you.
It's lovely to see you too. Landscape architecture or a good urban design can definitely save money and make us healthier. Can it actually add economic value to an urban environment?
Most definitely, because I did a piece for some business people in Birmingham and we were looking at the quality of the public realm in the city centre, which actually is really poor. So if you were a visitor to the city, you wouldn't have a particularly pleasant experience. So if you were thinking of moving to Birmingham to work, you would probably look at it and think, people have a very poor view of Birmingham and Birmingham New Street as it was. And that taints people's view of a city. Mm-hmm. Would you want to live there, work there, bring your children up there? So most definitely, the quality of the public realm sets the whole atmosphere and tone of a city. And property prices in cities are where the public realm's good are higher. If you've got trees in your street, the value of homes are higher. The income that's generated by council tax is higher for the local authorities. Yeah. And you attract people who've got a high-skilled workforce will come to a city that's beautiful. Why wouldn't you want to work in Oxford or Cambridge or Bath or Bristol? They are all really lovely cities. And the big industrial cities could and should aspire to doing the same. Really, because they're looking now to attract people back into the city centres to live and work. And they could bring so much more to the city economy if they could do that. And I think a city is its public realm. You look at the great cities of the world.
Totally agree. People want to live in beautiful places.
And it's not just about the buildings.
Yes.
I think we get too hung up on looking at that landmark building. And I know it happens in lots of planning authorities across the country. The councillors think, nice shiny new building. But actually, if you have to trip over paving flags to get to that building, it's not a pleasant experience.
Absolutely. It's where you spend your time.
Yes.
Is in the places in between.
So I think there are very good reasons for investing in landscape architecture, in designing our urban environment to really promote the sort of economic success of the city.
Can you see the changes? Can you see that there's been a sort of not a revolution, but an evolution in the last few years in the UK?
Yeah, I think you're right, Catherine. There has been an evolution. And if I go back to when I first started, I call it green toothpaste. We'd be asked to put a few Latin names and a bit of landscape around the base of a building. Yeah. Not all projects were like that, but there was quite a lot of that sort of bit of greenwash around a building. And I think now there's a new generation of other built environment professionals who do appreciate what we're doing. Yep. And the contribution, if we are early in a project, we can make a massive contribution and we can change the direction of a project. Yep. And my own practice has done that. And we've been fortunate to do that. Not on every project, but is getting better and we are becoming appreciated. And I think our skill levels are improving as well. So we are more respected than we used to be.
Are there countries that do this particularly well? Are we all at a similar stage, or are different countries or different regions responding or respecting the landscape more than, say, we are in the UK, or something to aim for?
Yeah, I think it's been a well-established profession in the UK and certainly in other parts of the world. Some of the European countries still struggle to be recognised as landscape architects, and it's often still architects who lead and actually do the landscape work.
Right. Wow.
Spain, for instance, and indeed France, I think I'm right in saying. Where they do landscape really well is somewhere like Singapore, where it's really planned in. It's a planning requirement to do green, to green up buildings, because they have green standards that they strictly adhere to. And the quality of landscape in Singapore is exceptional. It really is good. And we could all learn a lesson from them. I think the Americans do it really well.
Right.
They're very technical, and you just look at the High Line. They're great at repurposing infrastructure, old infrastructure, and they do big statewide projects, which are enormous compared to what we get the chance of doing here. And then, of course, you've got the Scandinavian countries, yes. Denmark, Copenhagen. They do public realm so well, and we could learn a lot. I think we do it well.
Yes.
We don't do it well enough.
Right.
I don't think, yeah.
And there's a lot of it coming from that being in at the very beginning, as you were saying before. It feels like 3 examples that you've given, all quite different, but it's just expected as part of the entire deliverable, not that bit at the end, as you say, the green toothpaste.
Right. And it was as interesting in the States. They often lead the design team.
Really?
So I think we could take note of that over here. We could be more confident in our abilities. I think that would help.
When we think about good landscape architecture and we think about some of these good examples, can we quantify the economic impact of good landscape architecture and urban design in our communities, whether it's health and well-being or social cohesion? How can we think about that?
Well, you would go back 20 years and there was nothing like that. Now there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of research, good quality research that's been undertaken by like Natural England, looking at health and well-being in connection with how close you might live to green open space. And the work that they did, I think it was with Newcastle University, they showed that if you lived within 300 metres of green open space, your health is vastly improved compared to people who live some distance away. It often means that those disadvantaged communities don't have the green open space, and those in the wealthier, leafier suburbs do. And I'm not saying it's all down to whether you can see a tree or not, but there is a lot of good evidence to show that there's the physical effects of atmospheric pollution, obesity, heart disease, diabetes. All of those are often in the more disadvantaged areas. And it happens that they don't have places to exercise. Yeah. They don't have the contact with nature. And I think there's a fantastic piece of research, which I think is about children who have contact with nature in the formative years go on to have very little mental health problems when they get older.
Really important part of their early years development.
Absolutely huge. And I think there's a piece of research that says if you live within 300 metres of green open space, if everybody did, it would save the NHS £2.1 billion a year.
It is. I mean, we've looked at similar research. So there's general savings. There's also a specific number in reduction of GP visits would just save 100 million just in one go. And then there's the billions that would be saved from the NHS with all of the different reduction in healthcare that would be required. It's huge. And I agree that it feels like there needs to be a prioritisation of green infrastructure or green urban space for communities that don't have access to it right now, who are maybe more disadvantaged and who could benefit from it more.
I did a talk just before COVID broke, really, and it was all about the importance of green open space. And if you have a healthy place, you have healthy people. Yeah. You know, the Victorians got it right.
Yes.
I come from Birkenhead, and Birkenhead Park was the first public park built in the UK. Wow. It was built by Joseph Paxton. And when Frederick Law Olmsted was going to enter the competition to design New York Central Park, he came over to Liverpool, went over to Birkenhead, went and visited Birkenhead Park, was so inspired by it, he went back and created this big green open space in the middle of New York.
The heart of New York.
And, and that was all triggered by cholera epidemics that were killing thousands of people. And, you know, the Victorians did a lot. We are now reaping the investment that they made 160 years ago.
Yeah, because we do have these lovely parks. We really do, and we should appreciate them. It's getting more of them.
Absolutely. When you think the population has more than doubled.
Exactly, and we've still got the same number of parks. Yeah. I know with your work at FIRA, you do a lot of work in healthcare, and I'd love to hear about the importance of landscape architecture in healthcare and how that benefits the community or the users of the healthcare places that you work with.
It is actually a really interesting subject because, again, it goes back many hundreds of years. There's always been a really good connection between medicine and the power of natural healing. You think that it used to be the monks and nuns used to deliver healthcare to the local community, and they would use local herbs. And so there's a big reliance on nature for health and healing. And that sort of carried on. And of course, it all fell apart with the dissolution of the monasteries. And when Henry VIII came in and decided Catholicism was gone,
right,
a lot of it got taken away. And that had a big impact on healthcare in the UK until the first purpose-built asylums, mid to late 1700s. And they realised if they built an asylum in the countryside and allowed the patients to have access to fresh air, green open space, to be involved in horticulture or agriculture, it actually improved their mental health and their behaviour. And there's this brilliant quote by the Commissioners of Lunacy. Brilliant title, isn't it? There's this quote, they said something along the lines of, they found that the patients didn't have to be tied up and in straitjackets for as long because they were able to go outside.
Wow.
I know it's very crude, but that's where it all came from. And then it wasn't really until Victorian times when you had Florence Nightingale. Yeah. She obviously is famous for the work she did in the Crimea, but actually what she did that has affected us all today was design the Pavilion Hospital, which allowed these green spaces between the buildings. So you had every window in the hospital looked out into a garden. And it's bringing that forward to today is what we do.
Yes.
Professor Roger Ulrich, the American, has done now the scientific work behind all of that, actually measuring the effect of a patient looking out the window onto green space and measured how quickly they get better. So they've measured patients all of the same type. I think they all had gallbladder operations. Right. They're in the same type of room. Some look out onto a brick wall. Some look out onto green spaces, and they measure the amount of analgesia they need, the amount of times they call the nurse, their general feeling of well-being. And they got out of hospital quicker. When a hospital bed is about £1,000 a day.
Again, it's
a huge, huge saving to the NHS.
Yeah.
And the patient's relatives felt better about it. And the staff feel better about it because it's their health and well-being as well. So that is what we've been doing for years, working on the healing landscape to support healthy outcomes in hospitals and to support some of the clinical work as well, whether it's rehabilitation or mental health or specifically for orthopedics or cancer care or something like that. So it gets very technical. Yeah. And I really like that.
You like that technical piece of it.
Yeah. And it's the evidence base that comes out of that is what I think we can take into general design using the evidence. It's there to actually underpin everything that we do and to work up an argument for landscape generally for public health.
Are there specific questions or specific ideas that you would develop when looking at a healthcare project versus, say, a residential or a public realm project?
Well, if we are master planning a big acute hospital site, that is really complicated because we're looking at pedestrian flows, cars, blue light access. Where does the hearse go to the mortuary? What is the patient journey like? Wow. How do they arrive at the hospital? How do they find their way from the bus stop or car park to the department or the consulting room they're going to? So we have to work very closely with the architects to do that. But it's all about placemaking, and it's very transferable to other things. But it's just more complicated,
it is
to
more
be
complicated.
honest.
You've got more variables. Yeah.
And then you get into the very detailed work on specific gardens. So you might work with clinicians to create a rehabilitation garden. So for instance, I worked on a project which was the replacement for Headley Court. And that is where the armed forces would go. If you were an injured service person, you would go to hospital, but then you would need rehabilitation afterwards. So if you'd been in Afghanistan and you've lost a limb, you would then go and have your prosthetic fitted, and then you have all the rehabilitation around that, around your mental health as well. And so we work really closely with the clinicians to develop gardens that would actually facilitate the physiotherapy, the occupational therapy, or allowing patients to coordinate properly if they've had brain damage. So it gets really technical.
Yes.
And that is really
interesting.
Really interesting.
Yeah, of course. Yes. You've got very specific things that you need to
very
work
specific
to.
requirements. And then when we work in oncology, it's different again. For instance, if somebody's having chemotherapy, they're usually very light sensitive, so they can't sit out in the sun. So we create shady corners in gardens so they can still have their beds pushed out, or we've worked with the architects to turn all the chemotherapy chairs around so they face outwards and can look out into courtyard spaces and that kind of thing. So it's working closely with the clinicians, having that sensitivity to the requirements, and then thinking creatively.
What can nature do to help all of these?
And just placing bird boxes outside. It's so important for people just to make those sort of connections and the distraction of nature.
As you say, you're using data, research, technical requirements, and your love of the outdoors and bringing it all together. So we've talked about that specifically with healthcare and before, looking at where the landscape really helps in terms of health and well-being, social cohesion, reduction in crime and violence. Bit of a controversial question, but how does the built environment do that?
If you get the built environment right, you can reduce crime, violence. If you're getting people comfortable about going out and using the space, it becomes passive surveillance and they're naturally policing an area. So you're less likely to have the crime and violence. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy sort of thing. And I think if you can create places where people want to be outside, and it's particularly important in the urban realm, and I think highlighted during the recent pandemic when people couldn't get out of high-rise residential, they had nowhere to go. All the shops are closed. There's literally nowhere for people to go and walk. And also to sort of socialise, and because we were all socialising in our local park. And if you haven't got a local park to do that, so you end up losing all that sort of social cohesion. And I think you can see it on streets where they've done some of these wonderful like Woonerfing schemes that people start doing things in front of their front door. Planters come out and the bike racks are there and suddenly you start to get neighbours talking to each other. And so I think the landscape, and when I say landscape, I mean hard and soft. I mean the urban design, the whole of that is absolutely critical for a functioning city if it's going to have proper social cohesion. And it's the glue that binds it all together. Architects tend to look at the building block. And the figured ground. And it's all black. And then you look at the white bits are the bits they can't cope with. But at the moment, sadly, 80% of public realm is highway. And often the bits that are left over become the public spaces and nobody wants to use those. So I think we've got to think about it more positively. Not always lead with roads.
How to get from somewhere to somewhere. Actually, how do you spend time somewhere?
And it's making it sort of good connectivity within a city so people can walk and encourage walking and having those green connections. So if you've got all these green spaces, you need the green routes.
Yes, like the one we interviewed Simon Pitt-Keatley from the Camden High Line. And that is a green corridor connecting Camden, basically, King's Cross all the way through Camden.
And people walk further if they can walk on a nice route. And that's another piece of research.
It's important, and we've talked about how we're the glue that kind of binds these areas together and really bringing societies together and bringing people outdoors, having pride in their outdoor spaces. So how can we as an industry raise the profile of and the importance, and we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but raise the importance and the profile of landscape architects and get more influence? You know, we all feel very passionately about this. And I think we could contribute a lot to society if a lot of these ideas were implemented in a larger scale. So what is the Landscape Institute doing?
Well, obviously, influence is, you rightly say, it's absolutely key. And that's one of the strategic goals for the Landscape Institute, is building our influence. But it's not something that you can just do overnight. And again, I think it needs all of us to participate in that, because we're all able to influence at different scales, at different levels. It doesn't have to be high level influencing all the time. But I think we've got to get more political. And I would like to see the Landscape Institute almost have a plan for creating leaders in our industry who might go on to be politicians. And I think until we are actually at the political table,
influencing policy,
I think we need to work at all levels. Don't get me wrong. But I think to have a substantial effect. I think we need to be more political. We're very good at talking to ourselves and saying, oh, how wonderful we all are, and this is our time, and slapping each other on the back and praising each other. But actually, we're not very good at talking outwards. And that's been one of the things I've really tried to do as president and as a practitioner as well. So I'm still hands-on. I know what it's like to be a landscape architect, and I know how frustrating it can be at times. I don't think it's changed enough in my lifetime. I'm quite disappointed. I thought it would change more than it has. And I think we got knocked back after the financial crisis 10, 12 years ago. I think that had a huge impact on our profession. I think we've recovered from that, but I think we lost some ground there. And there's also this feeling that other professionals feel they can do our job for us. And I think it's important that we have really strong skill set. We're technically competent. And actually, if I was going to be critical, I think there are quite a few of us who perhaps aren't as competent technically as we could be.
Right.
Some great creatives out there, but I think we've got to make sure we can get it onto the ground and it works and it lasts because there's no point doing something today that's in sort of 2 years' time looks an absolute mess. It gives us all a bad reputation. And sometimes that's not our fault. You know, It can be the client who's not maintaining something properly. But again, you know, we should be telling the client what's expected. So I think political influence and honing our skills so we're absolutely great craftspeople as well as designers.
You know, you've mentioned becoming, politicians. Are there any other committees or bodies that landscape architects could be part of that are wider, that have more influence? And you and I have talked in the past about, committees that maybe architects or RIBA would sit on that would be great for the Landscape Institute to sit on.
Yes, I think you're right. The Landscape Institute currently have some good roots into various parts of government, particularly with Natural England and the Design Council. And there are plenty of others that I can't think of at the top of my head at the moment. But this comes out of a conversation I had very recently with quite a well-known planner who was once president of RICS, Louise Brooke-Smith. And she spoke at our Planning Reforms Conference, and she said that landscape professionals need to start talking and get involved with funders because it's the funders who often make the decisions about whether they're going to invest in a particular development or not. A lot of them have a social conscience. They are looking to fund schemes that have a good social side, that they're environmentally sustainable and have all those attributes. And I think for us to start talking to them, which we don't do, we tend to sort of just talk to the developers if we're that lucky.
Right.
So I think it's finding out who those funders are and start talking to them. So as a piece of work, I want to try and do some more in the next few months.
And influence them to make sure they're making it part of their criteria and enable them to say, we need this.
And say, where is the landscape architect on this job? I want to start with the landscape architect. And I think if we can get in at the beginning, it makes all the difference. So I think we need to become game changers in that way and have that confidence to do it because we are specialists. It takes a long time to become a landscape architect.
Yes, it does.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
You know? So go out there, you're the specialist, go out there and put forward the arguments for it.
And do you think in terms of knowledge, sort of architects or other built environment professionals, knowledge of how specialist landscape architecture is, do you think there is that understanding, or is that one of the reasons why sometimes you have architects fulfilling a landscape architect?
I think you're right. There are a number of architects who probably don't fully understand what we do. It's not just about putting Latin names on the plan and doing some nice pictures. I think there are schools of architecture and universities that have landscape architecture and other landscape related courses are often more round because they've probably done joint projects. And I was lucky to have done that at Leeds. Yeah. Others don't.
Right.
And they've actually been tutored by some of the old guard as well who haven't ever worked with a landscape architect necessarily, although that their landscape architect is there to support the architect and that building. So it's trying to get beyond that. So I think the schools where you have landscape architecture planning, they're producing the next generation who are going to be more sympathetic, definitely.
We can see quite clearly some of the things that are happening, but a lot needs to happen. If you could sum up what you would love to see, say in 10 years' time, a reasonable time frame in terms of whether it's being involved very early or it's having more influence with funding, how would you like to see the profession or the amount of green urban space we have in 10 years' time?
That's a big question. And I'm going to give you probably two answers.
Brilliant.
I would say from a professional point of view, I would like to think that there is parity between all the built environment professionals. And I don't think any one of us can deliver healthy schemes that address climate and biodiversity without collaboration. We need to work together because we don't all work in our silos. And I think landscape architects are good collaborators.
Yes.
We're used to doing that.
Yep.
So we are more than happy to do that if we're allowed to. And I think there's more of that. And just being there at the start, it would be wonderful if we were the top of the list of consultants.
We want to
for our
start with that
clients.
green in the middle
Yeah.
and then build out. Yeah.
And if we could see the sea change that happened during the pandemic when everybody loved their parks so much, I'm a bit fearful that we've lost that momentum.
Yes.
Everybody was saying that they found a new love for their parks and wanted to see green spaces. Maybe it's going to morph into a different sort of movement, but I would like to see the public demanding more. And I think that's where the talk around landscape architecture is going to be so important. So the Choose Landscape campaign is being reformulated.
Yes.
It's going to be a programme with numbers of campaigns.
Yep.
It's not just about education, but it's about educating the public. Educating the decision makers, educating the clients. So if you were to talk to somebody in the street in 10 years' time and ask them, what did a landscape architect do? It wouldn't be, oh, they design gardens.
No.
Yes, they design gardens, but they design other things too. And they would have an appreciation for it.
My lunchtime is now completely different because I can go and sit outside with my colleagues.
I can walk from home,
Yeah.
drop the kids off at school and walk to work. And I can do that through a green route. And then on the way home, we can go and play in the local park. That'd be wonderful.
That would be amazing. Imagine that. I'd love it. How did you develop such a passion for landscape architecture?
It must go back to when I was a child. I always enjoyed being out of doors. I had a real affinity with nature, did a lot of walking as a teenager, used to go youth hosteling and really enjoyed the national parks. And I just wanted a job that would take me outside, but had some sort of design, technical side to it. I wanted to be in a profession, and this just ticked all the boxes for me. And I went on to really enjoying it. I couldn't see myself ever doing anything else. And it doesn't pay as well as being a lawyer or anything, but I really enjoy it. And I think it becomes a passion and a way of life rather than just a job.
So you knew as a teenager that this was a job that you wanted to aim for?
Yeah, I was quite fortunate. When I was in sixth form, I had a meeting with a guy from the Forestry Commission because I thought that might be a route I wanted to take. I was thinking about architecture and planning, and they just didn't quite do it for me. And I met this chap, and he described one of the consultants that used to work for the Forestry Commission. It was Dame Sylvia Crowe, who was in fact past president of the Landscape Institute. And he described what she did for the Forestry Commission, actually designing landscapes, big scale rural landscapes with the forest, using the trees as her medium. And I just thought that was what I wanted to do. A bit of outdoors, a bit of technical stuff. I really enjoy geography, really enjoy biology, throw a bit of history in as well. And that just was brilliant for me.
Amazing. What is the one thing that landscape architects and the landscape architecture profession do right now to combat climate disaster? I know we've read more and more about it in the last year. It's something the Landscape Institute has been talking about for a long time. What's something we could do right now?
Well, yes, as you rightly say, the Landscape Institute published a paper in 2008, and it's no surprise to any of us. In fact, if you did geography, as I did in the late 1970s, it was even in the geography books then. It was all about global warming and the melting ice caps. And I think it's that concern for nature we all have, and wanting to conserve and enhance it, which is in our DNA to do. But I think we are a very shy and retiring profession, and we're not very good at speaking out. If there's one thing that we could all do, is to try and develop our voices and be real advocates for landscape, particularly when you're working in a multidisciplinary team, not to be shy and retiring, but to get your voices heard and to really put forward the argument for having high quality landscape design in and on and around buildings and in those public spaces, and to really elevate the landscape profession within the design team.
Completely
I think that's
agree.
the one thing that we could all do.
Our voices.
Yeah.
I like that. And this is one of my favourite questions. If you could put a bench in one spot in the world, where would it be and why?
I'd have to have two places. I have to have one at home in the UK, and it would be Lower Town in St Martin's on the Isles of Scilly, overlooking the other islands and the beautiful white beaches and the turquoise blue sea. But for overseas, it would have to be in Doubtful Sound in New Zealand. It is just the most beautiful, unspoilt place I've ever been to.
Oh, wow.
Fantastic.
So you've got your two benches.
I've got two
Feels
benches.
like Desert Island
I'm
discs.
sorry.
Thank you so much, Jane. That's an awesome vision to end on. But thank you very much for coming in to join us today.
My pleasure, Catherine. Thank you.